Great. Thanks very much, Matthew. So from one Matthew to another, thank you very much to the organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this evening. It's a real honour to speak at this event. I don't think I've been involved in an event as multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary as this before. So what I want to do today is just give you sort of a 12, 13-minute overview of the research that I do in my lab and with my collaborators. And what I want to do initially is just give you kind of an overview of the basis for what we're trying to do and how we're trying to use, advanced imaging techniques of the brain to try to understand what is causing dementia, and especially what is causing the dementia that we know is associated with traumatic brain injury and sometimes repetitive head trauma that we see in concussive brain injuries, as the weekend that's in it of this great sporting occasion of Ireland playing South Africa tomorrow. So let me just bring you back to the basics of biology. So if you go to the library and take out any medical textbook and ask the question, what do the blood vessels in the human brain look like? This is the type of image that you'd see. You'd see this sort of it's like a beautiful oak tree. You get these large, you put your finger on your neck, you can feel your carotid arteries pumping oxygenated blood up into your brain. And it's really interesting that in vertebrate species, humans are quite unique in that they use a huge amount of the daily energy intake. So when the calories that are written on the back of your sandwich that you have for your lunch, 25% of the energy in that sandwich goes simply to make your brain work. Okay, so that's not even if you're trying to study, really intensely. That's simply sitting doing nothing. Your brain is consuming 25% of all your daily energy intake, and because of that energy intake, it means that it needs a lot of blood vessels. So the human brain has 100 billion brain cells. So 100 billion neurons make up the human brain, and because of that density of neurons, because those neurons or brain cells are so energy demanding, they need lots and lots of blood vessels. So we estimate that no neuron, so no brain cell, is ever more than about 20 micrometers. Okay, so 20 millionths of a meter away from a neuron. So that means that basically every brain cell in the human brain has its own little capillary to feed it. And part of the reason for that is because the brain has no capacity to store glucose. Okay, so the reason that you can go for a long run without eating and taking lots of glucose over and over again, because your liver can store glucose and can release it. Your brain can't store glucose. Okay, so it needs a constant energy supply. So if you think about that, if I was to take out all the small blood vessels that we call capillaries in the human brain and stretch them out side by side, they'd stretch from Dublin to Paris. If I was to look at the surface area, so if I was taking one little blood vessel and open it up, the surface area of all the blood vessels in the human brain combined would be the surface area of a tennis court, 20 square meters. So these type of images, medical textbook images, don't really do justice to the density of blood vessels in the brain. And you need to look at this. This is a vascular cast of a human brain. So what this image represents essentially is a molten liquid or a polymer has been injected into the systemic circulation and pumped around the circulation of a cadaver, of a dead body. And then the brain has been taken out of the skull and the brain tissue has been digested away in an alkaline bath. And what you're left with is a cast of the blood vessels in the human brain. So you can clearly see that the density is absolutely massive. So our real obsession in the lab is trying to understand, what do these blood vessels do in brain diseases? So from Alzheimer's disease to concussive brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, because of the proximity that I spoke about, the proximity of blood vessels to brain cells, if a brain cell becomes damaged, ultimately the blood vessel will become damaged as well. But we think about it the other way around. What if a lot of these conditions are driven by blood vessel dysfunction? Okay, so there's a concept that we won't go into much detail on, but it's called the blood-brain barrier. So these blood vessels are different from blood vessels in your fingers and blood vessels in your toes. These blood vessels tightly regulate what gets into and out of your brain on a daily basis. Okay, and it's there to protect you. So it's the properties of these blood vessels that we refer to as the blood-brain barrier. So a quick note on Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure Sean is going to cover this in great detail. Ireland, population of 4.5 million people. We've got about 38,000 people in this country have Alzheimer's disease. So it's one of the most common forms of dementia in the country. It's the fourth leading cause of death in people over the age of 65 globally. And a lot of people aren't familiar with this, but if you are ever exposed to a moderate or severe traumatic brain injury during your lifetime, after that injury, the acquired brain injury that you have about a 7-fold increased risk of progressing to Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. So traumatic brain injury is quite a strong causative factor in Alzheimer's disease. And a note on traumatic brain injury, head injury. So traumatic brain injury is the leading cause, it's the most common cause of death in children and young adults globally in the world. Okay, more people suffer traumatic brain injury every year than the numbers diagnosed breast, lung, prostate, brain, and colon cancer combined. Okay, so huge numbers of people get traumatic brain injuries every year. Every year in the UK, 1 million people attend emergency departments with a recent head injury. So 140,000 people in the UK alone are admitted to accident and emergency because of head trauma. In general, falls, assaults, road traffic accidents are the most common cause, but there's also sporting-related injuries that we see as well. And we talk about concussive brain injuries. So let me show you some images of a traumatic brain injury. So this is a CT scan, so you can think of it as an X-ray of the human brain. This is a young boy, 12-year-old boy, who's come off an all-terrain motorbike, and the bike has landed on top of him. And you can clearly see, if you look around the white halo here, that's the child's skull. And you can clearly see that it's not continuous anymore. There's these fractures, these depressive fractures. The arrow is pointing to what we call a hematoma, or a bleed on the brain. And over on the left-hand side of the image, which is the child's right-hand side of his brain, you can see these white speckles. That's called a contusion, so it's bruising on the brain. But in general, the rest of the brain looks okay. What happens in traumatic brain injury is, after the focal injury, swelling starts to occur. The brain has very, very limited capacity to swell. So these black areas that you see in the middle are the ventricles. They're full of cerebrospinal fluid, and they work as cushions in the human brain. They allow the brain to accommodate for a little bit of movement. But look what happens on day 2 after he was admitted to hospital. The scan is completely different. The swelling has increased in his brain, and the ventricles have almost collapsed in on themselves. This injury was so severe that the neurosurgeons, if you look at the top right of the image, on day 3, the neurosurgeons got in, they took out a portion of the skull to allow the brain to swell, okay? The brain is now swelling outside the confines of the skull, and 3 weeks later, it's still swelling, so huge amounts of swelling. Now, incredibly, this child survived the accident, okay? But the reason I show these images is that the individual who went into hospital will be a very different individual coming out of the hospital. He'll have lifelong injuries, and this child will now have a very, very increased risk of going on to develop dementia in later life, okay? So this is the legacy of severe traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is kind of strange in that it's got this spectrum of injury. So it's not like a cancer where we've got all these very different grades and subgrades. It's actually quite simple. It's mild, moderate, or severe, okay? So if you get a traumatic brain injury, it's considered mild, moderate, or severe. So those images that I just showed you were obviously severe traumatic brain injury. But my lab has recently become very interested in what we talk about as minimal or mild traumatic brain injury. So that's kind of where the remit of sports concussion comes in, you know, where a kid gets concussed on the rugby field or the GA field, and, you know, what is happening in the brain? We don't really know exactly what is happening. We know that severe traumatic brain injury is the greatest cause of mortality in children and young adults, as I mentioned, but we still are trying to get a grasp of the long-term consequences of concussive brain injuries. And it's pretty clear to see these injuries. We see them every single weekend in professional sports. The most amazing thing with all of these little images that I show you is that every single player there continued playing. So this is Australian rules football. That individual in the yellow and black had a seizure on the pitch after that brain injury, and he got up and continued playing because he was able to stand up, and he was cognitive. There was no mark clinically that something was wrong with him. He was able to continue playing. And to highlight sports-related concussion in Ireland, Ireland has one of the highest participations in sport globally, which is absolutely incredible for systemic and cardiovascular health. But it means that we see a lot of concussive brain injuries every weekend. So we've got about 400,000 people play GAA every weekend, 180,000 play rugby, 450,000 play soccer. And then we have all these other sports we don't know the numbers of: horse racing, riding, adventure sports. And then added into that milieu of sports-related concussions, we have people falling, you know, kids falling off their bike, falling out of trees. So concussive brain injury is a problem that we still don't fully appreciate or understand how it might contribute to dementia in later life. The American Academy of Neurology, this is what they say a concussion is: a clinical syndrome of biomechanically induced alteration of brain function, typically affecting memory and orientation, which may involve loss of consciousness. So in other words, we're not really sure. We don't really know what a concussion is. This is what a concussion brain scan looks like. So what do you see different in that scan? Absolutely nothing. A concussion brain scan looks normal. That's how a concussion is diagnosed. A concussion is diagnosed on the basis of seeing nothing on a brain scan. So having a clinical effect that somebody got knocked out or they got a hit to the head, but that if it's clear that there's nothing on an MRI scan or a CT scan, it means that it's concussion. Okay, so concussion is a negative brain scan essentially. So we're kind of stuck with this condition of a concussion is a form of traumatic brain injury, but there's nothing visible on an MRI scan or a CT scan. So where are we? What do we do? So about 7 or 8 years ago, I started working with Colin Doherty, who's now the head of the School of Medicine here in Trinity. And we came up with this idea that maybe what's happening in a concussion is that it's the blood vessels in the brain that are getting damaged. So rather than the neurons taking all the pressure and all the hit, that's probably why we can't see anything on standard imaging. Maybe it's the tiny, tiny blood vessels that are feeding those neurons that are getting damaged. And is there any way to image those blood vessels to be able to put a mark and say, there's the damage there, it's the damage to the blood vessels. So incredibly, what we have access to clinically is a technique called contrast-enhanced MRI. So essentially, when you're lying in an MRI scanner, we can have a small cannula, like a drip in your hand, and we can inject a dye, and the dye lights up the blood vessels. And we know the properties of this dye. We know that the dye does not diffuse across the blood vessels. So if the blood vessels are intact, the dye is not going anywhere. We'll see it lighten up and then it'll go out of the body. If there's any damage to the blood vessels, the dye will leak out of those blood vessels and we can detect it on brain scans. So let me show you some images. This is an image of a schoolboy rugby team that we image pre-season and again post-season. And what you're looking at here, this red speckly is a residual signal of the dye that's staying in the brain because the blood vessels are damaged. So if you look at the chart at the bottom, about 35 or 40% of these individuals, who are all 18, 19-year-old schoolboys, playing rugby at an elite level, had evidence of damage to the blood vessels after a full season of playing rugby. This is another one of the individuals. This is from a university team. Again, what we did here, instead of getting them pre-season and post-season, we asked the question of, what is the blood-brain barrier? What does the blood vessel integrity look like just after playing rugby? So playing 80 minutes of intense rugby. And this is AIL Division 1. This is elite rugby. This is this young man's pre-season scan. And this is 2 hours after he finished a rugby match. So you see all of this intensity that you see here is residual dye that's leaking out of the blood vessels and depositing in the brain. So what we think this is representative of is simply just the nature of the game, simply just repetitive head trauma. So in actual fact, we think that concussion is probably a red herring. It's the nature of these sports, because we know that sports that have well-defined, the rules of engagement are you try to knock somebody out, like mixed martial arts or boxing. We know that boxers, professional boxers, 20% of professional boxers will go on to develop dementia in their lifetime, trauma-associated dementia. And so what is the figure associated with professional rugby? What is the figure associated with professional MMA, with amateur games? We don't know yet, but that really is the modus operandi at the moment of my research group and my clinical colleagues. So to sum that up, the blood-brain barrier, this idea of the blood vessels in the brain, is altered when we compare pre-season to post-season rugby players. We know that it's altered after playing a full rugby match. And really what we're trying to do now is examining blood vessel integrity in concussive brain injuries will ultimately, I believe, direct how we treat and manage concussions in the future. And not just that, but I believe that this technology will have major utility in managing Alzheimer's disease and a whole range of dementias in the future. So what do we need to do? We don't need to cancel rugby. I'm a big rugby fan, I'm a big boxing fan, I'm a big sports fan. But what we need to do is we need to decrease exposure. Okay, and that means practicing less and maybe decreasing the number of games. And that's really the message that we're trying to promote at the moment. Finally, just to thank everyone who contributed to this work. There was lots of funding bodies involved in this work. This is some of my group out walking in Glendalough last week, or 2 weeks ago in the nice weather. And hopefully I've left enough time for some questions, and I'd be delighted to take questions from the floor.
I can start.
Yep.
I have a question on the link between traumatic brain injury and then CTE, or let's say Alzheimer's later life. Are there any genetic modifiers that might actually give us an insight as to who may be at a greater risk? Yeah, so there definitely are, and there's still a little bit of controversy in the field, but one of the greatest kind of predictors of sporadic Alzheimer's disease is a mutation in a gene called ApoE. Okay, and we know that there are mutations in this gene ApoE that will either protect you from Alzheimer's disease, almost give you lifelong protection, or make you susceptible. It's not fully penetrant, so it doesn't mean that if you have this mutation in ApoE, you definitely will get Alzheimer's disease. It gives you an increased risk. And we do know that people who have ApoE4 mutation, so if you carry the ApoE4 gene, the likelihood is that if you receive a traumatic brain injury, your risk of going on to develop dementia is heightened because you have that genetic background. So a lot of what we're seeing probably is
it's your genetic predisposition. If you have a certain genetic predisposition, your chances of getting dementia associated with traumatic brain injury are heightened. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, wearing the headwear, does that affect the outcome at all? Is it just people banging people? It doesn't matter when wearing it?
Yeah. So headgear has been shown. It's pretty profound now. The headgear absolutely it does nothing. In actual fact, it can make concussions worse because people feel emboldened to hit each other harder. So we know that from American football. Headgear was brought in initially in American football to stop fractures and lacerations, and it does a very good job at doing that. So if you're wearing a helmet and you go head to head with somebody, you probably are going to be protected from getting a skull fracture. But concussions, the way they work, they're based on very, very rapid acceleration, deceleration. So you saw in some of those little videos I showed you of one guy hits the midriff, and you see his whole head going forward and then shooting backwards. And what's happening there is that the brain is kind of being pushed forward as well, and then going backwards, and it's hitting off the inside of the skull and then hitting off the other side of the skull. It's called a coup contra coup movement. So it's basically the brain is kind of like the terminology that my clinical colleagues and my neurosurgical colleagues use. It's like a peeled plum tomato. That's the texture of it. Okay. And so if you think about it, a peeled plum tomato, if you shake it all up in a jar, it's going to be a little bit messy. So you need to really, really protect it. So so the answer is no. Helmets do nothing for, and if anyone ever tells you otherwise, it's a complete lie. Yeah. Yes.
Do you think that rugby, as is played at the moment, is going to last? In my time, you ran as but you try to avoid him. Now, a 24-stone front row forward is given the ball to barge his way to hit a poor opposite number.
Yeah.
And I think is it increasing? Is concussion increasing, or is brain damage increasing now?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I was just talking to Sean, who will speak next. It was a very different sport when I played, even as well. To give you an example of that, and that what you just said, that team that we worked with, the 18, 19-year-old schoolboy team, they won the senior cup the year that we were imaging them. The average weight of that schoolboy team was 80 kilograms. And they were 18 years old. I mean, that is bananas. And you're completely right. The game now is, it's played a lot of the breakdown, and running into people is, as good as running to space that you used to do. Personally, I think that there's too much tinkering with the rules of rugby. The game has evolved and it's been played. It's a very, very rough game. But our data, all the scientific data suggests that it's just exposure. Just decrease the exposure. You don't need to play every weekend. But when you turn on the television, there will be a rugby match on every single weekend. It's too much. It's far too much. And these guys, they don't get enough time off. It's not like soccer players, that they get 4 or 5 weeks off in the summertime, they go again because they're kicking the ball. Yes, they head the ball, and that can propagate damage as well. But they're playing too much, far too much. So I think, Sean, go ahead. Yep.
Just about age.
Yep.
And the difference between head impact and head traumas at different ages, and there's a lot of discussion around there being, probably less effective if you're in your mid-20s when you get a head trauma as a guy or as a woman. Versus, if you're getting them in teenage, and similarly, even the interest that we would, falls from a standing position is our biggest cause of trauma in this country. It's not about or anything like that. And a lot of the people I'd say in clinic have head injury after just having a simple fall at home.
Yeah.
Just at that later stage, it's what's the effect that age has as a risk factor?
Yeah, so we have a large study now where we're taking retired athletes. So I mean, in the context of taking cohorts of young athletes, then sort of middle age, and then retired athletes, we do have evidence now that the retired cohort that we had, and some of these guys would have played rugby to a very, very high level, and they are experiencing cognitive problems with vascular problems in their brain as well. But if the question is more along the lines of, is a concussion or head trauma in a 35-year-old different from a 15-year-old? I'd say absolutely. I mean, for severe traumatic brain injury, I do think that for severe TBI, the young brain can't accommodate swelling as well as the old brain, because there's not as much space. With natural age, the brain just declines in volume. But absolutely, if I would be concerned for the weekend warriors, the guys who are 30 years old who are still going out with their pals and playing rugby every Saturday. Find a different sport. That's my take. Unless you're being financially remunerated for it, you know, if you're 35 and you're getting a good salary from playing professional sports, well, take your chances, take your risk. We all have risks in our job. I work in a lab that's full of chemicals, you know, there's risk profiles and SOPs that have to be put in place. I just think there's a risk mitigation has to be put here, especially for the amateur game, because those numbers that I showed, they're all amateur players. 400,000 GA players, you know, the 80,000 rugby players, they're all amateurs. We need to protect them, you know, so it's, yes.
But these injuries can be caused by rapid and accelerated.
Yeah.
Those seeking rabbits, like roller coasters, this happen, and like this, like microvascular damage gives out, and then this situations.
You can see there are case reports and case series of microvascular damage from roller coasters. They're mostly things like what we call a valsalva, where you might get little microhemorrhages in the brain or the retina at the back of the eye. Generally, though, a lot of the movements that you see in a roller coaster, the movement from high G-force to low G is a bit more gradual than a hit where it's literally you're going from. So we've done a mouthguard study to give you an example where we can measure the G-force, and some of the G-forces that have been exposed, these individuals have been exposed to, would exceed 80 to 90 G, but they're split seconds. You know, those videos that you see the NASA astronauts training on, they can only really go up to 6 or 7 G-force for a couple of minutes, otherwise they start, you know, losing consciousness. But the forces are much higher with the concussive brain injury than you would get on a roller coaster. They're much more gradual on a roller coaster. Good question, though.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Thank you.
That was really interesting.